Well, hello, everybody. Let's talk about building a voting machine everyone can trust, which is something that we've been working on at VotingWorks for the last 6.5 years, conveniently since my last Enigma talk. So this is how they count votes in France. Paper ballots spread out on the table, you make piles, and you count them. And so why don't we count votes this way in the US? Why do we use voting machines? We use voting machines because of our ballots. Because our ballots don't look like the idealized ballot on the left, which is one contest, 5 options, pick one, everything's great. If that's how your elections look, you should probably count ballot by hands. That's great. But our ballots look like the one on the right, and that picture is not one ballot, it's not 4 ballots, sorry, it's 1 ballot, right? 4 sheets, 1 ballot. That happens to be a California ballot. People love to pick on California. They're not the only ones. Texas, Arizona, lots of states have ballots that are dozens of contests long. Why? Because of the federal system. If you don't like it, take it up with the federal system. It's not going to change anytime soon. And because we have ballots that are so long, and also ballots that change from voter to voter, if you cross the street into a different congressional district, your ballot's going to be slightly different than your neighbor's. All that complexity is why we use machines to count ballots. By the way, my timer hasn't started, just so you know. It still says 30. I'll try to keep an eye on it. Thank you. We've had machines in the US for a long time. We had lever machines that lasted for 100 years. We had punch card machines, which were made famous in the Florida 2000 election. We had paperless touchscreen voting machines, which were made famous in many USENIX security talks. These days, if you vote in person, you're voting on something like this, a precinct tabulator where you're filling out a ballot by hand, filling in some bubbles, and casting it in a machine that will count it, tabulate it, and drop it in a sealed ballot box. I'd like to make a caveat here that I am not talking about accessibility in voting today. It's a really important topic. I don't mean to diminish it. It's just I only have 20 minutes. And so for today, I'm going to be talking mostly about hand-marked voting and machines, but a lot of what I talk about also applies to ballot marking devices and machines that are used for voters with disabilities. Okay, so hopefully you believe me that we need voting machines, but how can we trust them? How can we make sure that Russia hasn't hacked them, that the kid down the street hasn't hacked them, right? How do we trust them? There's always been 2 key ideas, not always, but for a long time now, we've had 2 key ideas in our community that we should have paper ballots that the voter can handle and see and check on their own, and that we should run post-election audits, ideally something called a risk limiting audit, which is roughly a statistical process that looks at a sample of the ballots to make sure that the tabulation was done correctly. And if we have those 2, then we're great, right? Paper ballots and post-election audits are great. But while we were worried about preventing our voting systems from getting hacked, we forgot that most public trust issues with voting machines don't stem from hacks. They usually stem from human error. And so the main point I want to make today, and the only slide you have to remember, we don't have to remember it, but the only slide you might remember is that we should make voting systems resilient to human error. That's the main thing we can do for trust. And I'm even going to go a little further. For public trust, resilience is more important than security. I'm going to illustrate this with 3 stories. First story, it takes place in Windham, New Hampshire in November 2020. What you should know about New Hampshire is that elections are administered by towns, 300 towns, each of them managing the elections for their citizens. And in 2020, of course, with COVID, many more voters were voting from home by mail. So the town of Windham, like many towns in New Hampshire, had to rush to get more ballots that they could mail to voters. And the ballots usually are pre-scored, pre-folded, so you can stuff them in an envelope and send them away. They didn't have enough of those pre-scored ballots, so they folded them themselves manually, and they made a mistake, which is that some of the folds went through the bubbles. So what? Well, what happens with some tabulators is that when the fold goes through the bubble, that's picked up as a mark, as if somebody had filled in that bubble. So what you had in Windham, New Hampshire, because of the position, the folds tended to go through the Democratic bubble, just because of how the ballot was laid out. So if you voted Democratic, not a big difference, but if you voted Republican, the scanner saw your bubble filled as Republican, and then the other one filled, and it canceled the ballot as an overvote. Now, I'm giving you the explanation of what happened in Wyndham, but you got to think about what happened the next day. They didn't have the explanation. All they saw was the result with far fewer Republican votes than expected and far more overvotes than expected, and people freaked out, right? Now, there were paper ballots, so we were able to recover. There was a whole audit with some experts that came in to look at everything and figured everything out. That's how I can tell you the story of what happened in Wyndham, New Hampshire. We had the paper ballots. We were able to recover. But for public trust, it almost didn't matter. The trust was shattered the moment that equipment malfunctioned, as badly as it did. And to this day, we do a lot of work in New Hampshire with VotingWorks. To this day, if you mention Wyndham, when you're talking to a clerk in New Hampshire, 5 years later, you can see them visibly shudder. They're really stressed out about how much public trust was broken by that one event. So what's the lesson we should take from here? Make sure ballots are never inappropriately folded? Is that a reasonable lesson? All right, let's move on to story number 2. I'm not only going to pick on other people, I'm going to pick on us too, because we've made mistakes at VotingWorks. We started doing elections in New Hampshire in 2022, and in our first pilot, where we did 3 towns with our voting equipment, we learned something. We learned that markers are like kryptonite to voting machines. Why? Because modern tabulators squeeze a piece of paper through 2 plates of glass so they can take an image as the ballot goes through. And what happens if you have a voter using a marker and that voter goes to town on those bubbles, really fills them in real good to make sure that it's counted, and proceeds to put the ballot through the scanner before the ink is fully dry, the ink might smear a little bit, just a little bit, on the glass. And so the next ballot that scans, there might be this thin vertical stripe that's low enough because we binarize the ballot. It's okay, it doesn't get picked up. But then it starts to get picked up as more of this happens, and now we're starting to see bubbles that are not marked, that are now being read as being filled 3 to 4%. That's okay, that's below the threshold, but pretty soon it's above the threshold, and now you have a disaster on your hands. And that's what happened to us an hour into our first pilot in New Hampshire. The machine started rejecting ballots consistently. And we had to try to figure out what was going on. We're using pens like we told you. No, we were using markers. Why are you using markers? Because that's what we did before. We've always used markers. I don't know, we didn't listen. Paper ballots were there. We could have recovered. But the pilot was stopped at 10 a.m. because the ballot rejections worried voters, understandably. And we had to go through months of press after that to explain to folks why, bad press that accused us of like, hey, you know, are these machines actually reliable? So lesson number 2, make sure voters never use markers. Okay? Let's go to story number 3. Antrim County, Michigan, November 2020. If you spend some time on voting, or if you've been to USENIX Security before, you already know parts of this story because Alex Haldeman presented a talk at USENIX Security 2022 on a forensic investigation that he did about the Antrim County, Michigan election in November 2020. If you haven't seen the talk or you haven't read the paper, I strongly recommend it. They're really, really good. It's kind of a first of its kind, true scientific forensic investigation of an election mishap. But I want to tell you a little more about this mishap. And I want you to go back in time in your mind to November 4th, Wednesday, November 4th, 2020, the morning after Election Day. The election between Trump and Biden is too close to call. And one of the states where it's too close to call is Michigan. And Antrim County is that deep red county that's at the tip of the index finger on the Michigan mitten. Tip of the ring finger, my bad, ring finger. This is a deep red county that in 2016 voted overwhelmingly for Trump, 2-1. And on Wednesday, November 4th at 4 a.m., the county releases its results in 2020, and Biden wins the county by a 2-1 margin. Everybody wakes up on Wednesday morning, and Republicans sound the alarm. This doesn't make sense. There's no way that we flipped from 62% Trump in 2016 to upside down this time around. It could not have happened. And they're right. That doesn't happen in US elections. You don't get that kind of shift in 4 years, right? The county goes to work, hold on, we're looking into it, and a few hours later, the news comes out that there was a software issue that skewed the initial results, which is like the last thing you want to hear the day after Election Day in a tight election, right? The county noticed that the voting looked improbable. Oh, great. So if the voting was probable, then we wouldn't have noticed. That's a problem, right? The software was updated and unofficial results now show that President Trump wins the county. Great. Problem solved, right? I want you to put yourself, maybe you're a Trump voter, maybe you're not, maybe in that case, put yourself in the mind of a Trump voter, right? How do you feel about this? This doesn't feel good. Your next question is going to be, well, okay, if there was a software issue or a computer glitch or a configuration error, where else might it apply? I mean, Michigan just got called for Biden on Wednesday night at that point. Are there other counties where this could happen? And sure enough, at that point, the White House is tweeting out, you know what? This Antrim County issue, it might apply to as many as 47 other counties in Michigan. And you know what? It's not an unreasonable thing to wonder about in that moment, in the fog of, right after the election. Now people start to wonder, wait a second, this computer glitch, who was the vendor in Antrim County, Michigan? On Wednesday, November 4th, probably none of you knew the name of the vendor in Antrim County. But by Saturday, November 7th, you all knew the name of the vendor, Dominion Voting Systems. The story of Dominion Voting Systems didn't start in Georgia. It started in Antrim County. And then, after people worried about what happened in Antrim County, they started thinking, well, where else is Dominion being used? Oh, it's used throughout the state of Georgia? The whole state of Georgia uses Dominion Voting Systems? And Biden is winning by 0.3%? Can somebody find me a computer glitch somewhere in Georgia that might explain this, right? It's a reasonable thing to be worried about. Now, let's be clear. Georgia did a complete recount of its ballots, both by machine and by hand, and they confirmed that Biden won the state. But it's a reasonable concern to have, and that audit took, 10 days. In those 10 days, people's opinions about what happened can be pretty locked in. So what happened in Antrim County that started this, right? Well, this is from Alex Halderman's talk. The cause was human error, compounded by more human error, and then he says, but you know what? The election software could have done more. And I want to kind of flip that on its head and say, yeah, I think the election software could have done a lot more. Because what was the human error in Antrim County? In Antrim County, there was at the last minute a change in the ballot, which happens all the time. Mistakes are made. It was a local school board contest. They forgot one of the bubbles. And so they changed the ballot design for those precincts, a subset of the precincts in the county, and they reconfigured the tabulators for those precincts. But they didn't reconfigure the tabulators where that contest didn't show up. Seems reasonable, except turns out it's not. Because when you aggregate results from tabulators in that voting system that are configured with different elections, there's now an off by one error. And you're adding Trump and Biden votes together and assigning them to Biden. And there's no giant alarm on the voting system that says you shouldn't do this. So is that human error? Is that the conclusion? Let's remember, Michigan did everything right. They have paper ballots, mostly marked by hand. In fact, they're one of the first states to run statewide risk-limiting audits on their elections, and they did a pilot of that in 2020. And in fact, if they had run that risk-limiting audit, and if the Antrim glitch applied to many more counties and had in fact affected the outcome, the risk-limiting audit would have caught it. 2 weeks later, too late. So I guess lesson number 3 is make sure humans don't make errors. I want to propose that we need to shift our thinking. Paper ballots and audits are the reserve parachute of elections. You should not jump out of a plane. I've never jumped out of a plane. If you jump out of a plane, you should not jump out of a plane without a reserve parachute. That is my understanding from everybody I know who does this. You shouldn't do this. If you run an election, you should not run an election without paper ballots and without post-election audits. But also, you shouldn't jump out of a plane only with a reserve parachute. And you shouldn't run an election only with paper ballots and post-election audits. Paper ballots and audits are necessary, but they are far from sufficient. And the notion of building resilience into our voting systems is not an implementation detail. I think as a community, we've shied away from the notion of really looking at the equipment and talking about how we should build resilience engineering into it, because that gets complicated. That gets into the weeds of the vendors and what they're doing and all of that. I don't think we have a choice, because I think stopping at paper ballots and risk limiting audits is just not enough. Did you notice something, by the way, about paper ballots and risk limiting audits in the stories I gave you? They're not even used for security purposes. They're actually used for resilience. Election administrators use paper ballots as a fallback in case the equipment malfunctions. We use risk limiting audits in case somebody made an error in configuring the scanner. That's really what they're being used for. They serve a dual purpose. They serve the resilience purpose and the security purpose, making sure we make no mistakes, making sure the systems aren't hacked. But the resilience purpose is what tends to be extremely important for trust. Okay, so I want to give you 2 examples of how we've tried to build resilience into the VotingWorks voting system. And we're open source, so other vendors can steal these. These are some lessons we've learned, but they're not proprietary to us. One of the things we've done is we constrain configuration changes to the ballot. Every paper ballot has a QR code on it that includes the hash of the ballot definition. So that if you change a bubble, if you change a contest, if you change the wording, if you change the layout, that changes the hash of the configuration, which changes the QR code on there. Which means when you scan a ballot, the scanner can look at that QR code and say, okay, the hash is whatever, let's look that up. I don't have that configuration, I refuse to scan this ballot. This stops so many accidental misinterpretations of ballots, I can't even describe it, right? Simple little tweak like that. That's one thing we do. We make it really hard for you to have a mismatched ballot and configuration. Another thing we do is we consider all the ways in which paper can fail. So what do we do now? Well, when you scan a ballot in our tabulator, if any ink ends up on the glass, we do image processing, we detect the vertical streak, we reject the ballot, we warn the poll worker. Scanner needs to be cleaned. And then mechanically, we also make it really easy for you to clean it. So by all means, tell your voters to use pens. You should do that. Expect some of them will not listen to you and use markers, and then you can recover from that too. When we show this to election administrators, they just kind of, they go calmer. It's one less thing to worry about. Another thing we do is we use a scanning unit that shines light on the paper from 2 different angles so that it can filter out folds and shadows. You can crumple up a ballot, uncrumple it, put it through the scanner, and it will only pick up marks. It will never pick up folds. Everybody else can do that too. Everybody else should do that too. We should make voting systems resilient to human error. I think it's the most important thing we can do for public trust. Of course we should have paper ballots. Of course we should have post-election audits. But if we stop there, we're not doing nearly enough. All right, I have one more story to tell you. Because no matter how hard you try, how hard we try, there are going to be problems in elections, right? And when problems occur, and this echoes a talk earlier today, transparency is the only way to maintain trust. So I want to tell you about one of the most stressful times we've ever had at VotingWorks. Happened about 18 months ago. During ballot testing with a number of tabulators in the state of New Hampshire, we saw reports from folks telling us that the scanner was rejecting ballots way more often than they expected. And if they tried again, it would usually accept it, but it would just give a generic error and reject the ballot first every 10 ballots, then every 5 ballots, then every 4th ballot. And that's not acceptable. You can't have a scanner that's like sometimes rejecting a ballot and then later accepting it. When we looked into it, and this is 6 days before a critical election, we realized that a set of environmental conditions that we had never predicted, and to this day we cannot fully explain, caused a particular line of code to be executed that we thought we had tested properly, that was covered by test coverage, but the conditions were slightly different between our test fixture and the actual image that was coming back from the scanner, and it was just causing these crashes, right? Now we had all the defensive programming in place so that the crash was local and it would recover and you could scan the ballot again and go. But the bottom line is there was a bug that was triggered that we'd never seen before. We knew how to fix it. It was 1 line of code. We sent it to the test lab reviewed it, approved it. We sent it to the Secretary of State of New Hampshire, they reviewed, they approved it. We fanned out across the state of New Hampshire and we updated every tabulator across the state that we had deployed 2 days before the election. And then the election ran and the audits ran and everything went perfectly well. It was the most stressful week of my life. And as we deployed this to every scanner in New Hampshire, more than once, we had a clerk say, I don't like this. I don't like this updating the software 2 days before an election. But you know what? You're open source. So I can have one of my local nerds here go and look at the code change you made and make sure that it's okay. And we've generally poo-pooed the notion, not poo-pooed, but we've not been as a community very excited about the notion of open source in voting systems. Sure, open source it, it's great. We haven't been excited about it because we've said, you know, an attacker could install different code on the machine than the source code you've published on the website. So, you know, who cares? But in the real world, the transparency of open source constrains the attacker so much, right? For us, the vendor, to be cheating the towns, we would have to literally be claiming one thing and saying, this is the code we put on the machine, and then fraudulently install different code. And we have to do that in a way that somehow tricks the test lab, in a way that somehow tricks the state, and all of that. So yes, in theory, open source does not solve all the problems, but it sure solves a lot of the trust problems by putting everything out there, by being open to scrutiny. And so the claim I want to finish with is that a voting system everyone can trust must be resilient to human error and must be open source. Thank you.